Inside the small church in Shreveport, Louisiana, the familiar warmth of a community gathering filled the room. The gentle creaking of wooden chairs sliding across the polished floor mixed with the low hum of quiet conversations. Soft golden lights illuminated the space, creating a cozy and intimate atmosphere, much like the church's usual Bible study sessions or post-Sunday service potlucks. But tonight, something felt different. At the front, Donald Trump stood at the podium. With his characteristic confidence, he addressed the crowd, a mix of families, elderly citizens, and local residents. His familiar presence, from his sun-kissed complexion to his bold gestures, made the room feel like part of a larger story. Yet tonight, there was a certain contemplative air about him, as though he recognized the gravity of the moment. Amid the crowd sat a little girl next to her mother. Emily, dressed in a pristine light blue dress, sat quietly, clutching an old, worn, leather-bound Bible with faded gold lettering. It was the last keepsake from her late grandmother. Emily took a deep breath, her wide eyes filled with curiosity, though tinged with a sense of seriousness beyond her years. Her mother leaned down and whispered softly, "You can ask your question, but only if you're truly brave and believe it matters." Emily nodded, her small heart pounding in her chest. She had rehearsed her question hundreds of times, scribbling it in her school notebook, murmuring it under her breath before bed. Now, as the moment approached, her tiny hands trembled, gripping the Bible as though letting go might make the question disappear. Trump began his speech, touching on policies, achievements, and his hopes for America's future. Sporadic applause echoed through the room, but there was a palpable sense of anticipation in the air. Something bigger, unspoken, seemed to be quietly unfolding. Finally, the question and answer session began, and the audience quickly lined up. The first questions revolved around local issues, policy discussions, and a few compliments about Trump's signature style. Meanwhile, Emily stayed in her seat, her small feet tapping lightly on the floor as she gathered courage. Her mother gently placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "You can do this, Emily," she whispered. Taking a deep breath, Emily stood up. She took small, deliberate steps toward the line, still clutching her old Bible tightly against her chest. Gradually, the room began to notice the presence of the petite girl, her determined yet hesitant demeanor drawing silent attention. Eyes followed her as she walked, and the quiet hum of conversation subsided. Standing in line, Emily gripped her Bible so tightly that her knuckles turned white. The line ahead seemed to stretch on forever, but she refused to turn back. Waves of nervousness washed over her, but alongside them rose an inner strength she hadn't felt before. When it was finally her turn, Emily stepped forward slowly. The room grew so silent that even the faintest breaths could be heard. All eyes were on her, a little girl in a light blue dress, holding an old Bible close to her chest. The whispers had stopped entirely, as though the entire room was holding its breath, waiting for something extraordinary to happen. Trump looked down at the little girl. His eyes, often sharp and commanding, softened with curiosity. Leaning slightly toward her, he offered a gentle smile, his voice unexpectedly tender as he asked, "What's your question, young lady?" Emily took a deep breath, her small chest rising and falling as though she needed all her strength. Her heart seemed to pound so loudly it could echo across the entire room. Yet her eyes shone with determination. Her voice, though quiet, was steady as it broke the heavy silence. "Sir, what does God mean to you?" Her question rang out like a bell, piercing the stillness. In that moment, time seemed to freeze. The room, which moments ago had been filled with whispers and the occasional creak of chairs, fell into complete silence. Every gaze, from the elderly seated in the back to the young adults standing near the podium, was fixed on Trump. For a man known for his quick wit and confident responses, Trump stood motionless. Not a word escaped his lips. His eyes lingered on Emily, then flickered to the worn Bible she clutched tightly in her hands, before finally settling into a deep, reflective stare. The atmosphere shifted. This was no longer the usual energy of a political gathering. Emily's question wasn't ordinary. It was profound, reaching into the deepest parts of the soul. It was the kind of question that even adults hesitate to ask, the kind that forces one to confront their innermost doubts and hopes. Trump exhaled slowly, his hands resting lightly on the edge of the podium, as though grounding himself. "That's a big question," he began, his voice lower, steadier than before. "And it's not one I've always had an answer to." The audience collectively held their breath. A man known for his unshakable certainty was now admitting vulnerability. In that moment, Trump wasn't the political leader towering over the crowd. He was just another person, standing shoulder to shoulder with everyone else, grappling with life's most profound mysteries. Emily remained quiet, her wide eyes never leaving his face. She didn't need to say more. Her gaze spoke volumes. She wasn't looking for a rehearsed answer or an idealized response. She wanted to hear his truth, the story of a man who had reached the pinnacle of power yet, like everyone else, had moments of searching for meaning and faith. Trump paused, his gaze drifting somewhere far away, as if he was sifting through old memories. The room stayed silent, devoid of any movement or murmur. Emily's simple question carried a weight that no one in the room could ignore. "When I was your age, Emily," Trump began, his voice lower, more thoughtful than before, "I had questions about God too." His opening words gripped the room, drawing everyone in like a thread pulling them closer. The commanding tone of a politician was gone, replaced by the vulnerable voice of someone sharing a piece of himself. "Every Sunday my parents would take me to church," he continued, his hands gently gripping the podium as though steadying himself. "I'd sit there, staring at the colorful stained glass windows, wondering if God could even hear me. Even in church, I sometimes felt like he was so far away." A wave of unspoken understanding rippled through the crowd. Some nodded quietly, their own memories surfacing. Perhaps they too had once sat in church pews, staring out into the light, searching for answers they couldn't quite grasp. Trump looked back at Emily, his tone softening further. "My father used to tell me," he said, "that faith is like a ladder. You climb it one step at a time, even when you're scared it might break." He smiled faintly, a touch of sadness behind the gesture, as though recalling a simpler time. "I didn't understand it then," he admitted. "I thought he was just saying that to keep me quiet." A gentle chuckle rippled through the audience, breaking the tension for just a moment. But the mood in the room remained reverent as Trump's story began to shift from a childhood memory to something deeper. "Maturing didn't make those questions disappear," he said, leaning slightly forward, his voice now carrying more weight. "It made them bigger. I began to wonder why the world could be so unfair, why good people suffered while others seemed to flourish without care." His words resonated deeply. In the stillness, the audience felt the truth of their own unspoken doubts and questions reflected back at them. I sat there, staring at the colorful stained glass windows, watching the sunlight stream through. And I wondered if God was truly listening to me. Even while sitting in church, I felt as though God was distant, far beyond my reach. A gentle wave of emotion rippled through the room. Many, especially the older members of the audience, nodded quietly. Perhaps they too had once sat in Sunday services, gazing at stained glass, feeling much like Trump, searching for something they couldn't quite understand. Trump paused briefly, his gaze returning to Emily. The little girl looked up at him, her eyes shining with attentiveness and quiet empathy. "My father used to tell me," Trump continued, his voice softening, "that faith is like a ladder. Every step you take is a challenge. And sometimes, you'll feel scared, as though the ladder might break beneath you. But you have to keep climbing, because something greater is waiting at the top." He smiled faintly, a bittersweet expression crossing his face, as though recalling a younger version of himself sitting quietly in church, listening to his father's words. Back then, I didn't understand, Trump admitted, a hint of humor flashing in his eyes. I thought he was just saying that to keep me quiet. A light chuckle rippled through the audience, momentarily breaking the solemn silence, though the emotional weight of his words lingered. Trump leaned slightly forward, as if sharing a secret with everyone in the room. But as I grew older, my questions didn't go away. They only grew bigger. I started to wonder why life could be so unfair. Why good people, as my father would say, had to endure suffering they didn't deserve. His voice now carried a rare authenticity, pulling the audience deeper into his reflections. No one dared to look away. There were times, he confessed, when I asked myself if God even existed. And if he did, why didn't he answer my questions? The quietness of his words echoed like a bell through the room, resonating deeply in the hearts of those listening. Trump's vulnerability was palpable, and the crowd wasn't just hearing his doubts, they were confronting their own. He took a deep breath, as though bracing himself for something more profound. But then, he said, his tone beginning to shift, carrying a subtle warmth. I realized that faith isn't about having all the answers. Faith is about accepting that there's something greater than yourself and trusting that everything happens for a reason, even when you can't see it. Emily remained where she was, her young eyes filled with thoughtfulness, but now seeming calmer. She said nothing, but the way her small hands clutched the worn Bible seemed to indicate that something inside her was falling into place. A missing piece of her heart gently finding its way home. Trump paused again, his hands lightly gripping the edge of the podium as if steadying himself. His gaze grew distant, reflective. But life, he said, lowering his voice to a near whisper, has a way of teaching us lessons we never wanted to learn. The audience leaned in, their eyes fixed on him. There was something deeply human, deeply real, in his tone. A vulnerability that reached beyond his usual persona. As I got older, Trump continued, I thought I had everything figured out. I had plans, ambition, and all the confidence a young man could have. But then, my life changed forever when I lost my brother, Fred. A wave of solemnity swept over the crowd. The mention of Fred shifted the atmosphere once again, deepening the connection between Trump and his listeners. In this moment, the room wasn't filled with spectators at a political event. They were individuals sharing in the raw, unfiltered pain of a man who had lived through loss. The room fell into absolute silence. No more creaking chairs, no more murmurs. Every word he spoke reverberated deeply within those listening. Fred, Trump said, his eyes reflecting an indescribable sadness, was one of the kindest, most genuine people I've ever known. He had a light about him, something I couldn't fully understand at the time. But he had his own battles, battles that our family couldn't change, couldn't fix. Trump's voice caught momentarily, and he drew a deep breath before continuing. And then, he was gone too soon. I can still remember that day vividly. The pain of losing him felt like it took a part of me with it. The audience, so accustomed to Trump's confident and commanding presence, now saw someone entirely different. A man standing before them, not as a leader, but as a grieving brother who had endured the heartbreak of losing someone he deeply loved. The day Fred passed away, Trump said, his voice heavier now, I was angry. Angry at him. Angry at myself. And angry at God. I couldn't understand it. How could God let this happen? Why would someone as good as Fred, with all his kindness and potential, have to suffer? And why was I, with all my flaws and mistakes, the one left behind? His words seemed to cut straight into the hearts of those in the room. Each person appeared lost in their own thoughts, revisiting their own losses and the times they too had questioned the fairness of life. Trump took a deep breath, his hands gripping the edge of the podium as though grounding himself. But when he continued, his tone softened, carrying a sense of unexpected peace. One night, he began, I had a dream. I saw Fred. He was smiling, that big, goofy smile he always had. and he said to me, "Don't be angry, Don. You've got work to do." The recounting of his dreams swept through the room like a refreshing breeze. A few members of the audience bowed their heads, silent tears rolling down their cheeks. Perhaps they too had experienced dreams of loved ones they longed to see again, moments that felt like a gift from beyond. Trump paused, his voice now steadier, yet filled with a profound sincerity. "I don't know if it was just a dream or something more, but when I woke up, I realized that faith isn't about understanding everything. Faith is about trusting, even when you can't see the full picture. And I think maybe Fred was here to teach me that." Trump glanced at the audience, his expression gentler than it had been all evening. "When you ask me what God means to me, Emily," he said, his voice soft but purposeful, "I want you to know that God is the reason I keep going, even when the road feels its darkest. He is the reminder that, even when we fall, there is still hope to rise again." Emily stood silently, her eyes no longer just curious, but now carrying a depth of understanding beyond her years. She didn't say anything, but the way she clutched the worn Bible in her hands suggested that she, too, had found a piece of the answer she had been searching for. The room was saturated with silence, not the silence of indifference, but the kind born from shared reflection. Trump's words were not just his story. They had become a thread connecting everyone in the room, a light reaching into the deepest corners of their hearts. In that moment, the audience wasn't just listening, they were feeling. His vulnerability had become theirs, and the story of Fred had become a mirror for their own losses, their own struggles, and the hope they desperately sought to hold on to. At the back of the hall, a middle-aged man slowly rose to his feet. He wore a simple button-down shirt, his calloused hands revealing a lifetime of hard work. Yet, when he spoke, his voice was steady and resonant, carrying a weight that immediately filled the room. "Mr. Trump," he began, his words cutting through the stillness like a gentle breeze, "do you think most of us are afraid to admit that we're struggling with faith? I've spent my whole life trying to be strong, but sometimes I wonder if I'm just pretending to be." His question hung in the air like a bell, echoing in the silence. Many in the audience nodded quietly, their expressions revealing that they too had felt that fear, the fear of admitting weakness, of questioning their beliefs. Trump met the man's gaze, his eyes filled with understanding and compassion. "You're absolutely right," Trump said, his voice now low and firm. "We're afraid that if we admit we're struggling, people will think we're not good enough. But the truth is, faith isn't about being perfect. Faith is about trying, even when we don't have all the answers. It's about taking steps forward, even when we're not sure where the path will lead." Trump's words washed over the room like a wave of quiet emotion. Some began to exchange glances, their faces softening into gentle smiles of shared understanding. Then, a woman with silver hair neatly pinned into a bun stood up slowly. In her hand, she held a white handkerchief, and her eyes glistened with a pain that time had yet to erase. "I lost my husband last year," she said, her voice trembling but clear. "He was everything to me. Since the day he passed, I haven't been able to pray. I can't believe that God is still listening to me. Do you think it's too late for me to find my faith again?" Her question froze the room. Anyone who had lost someone they loved could feel the weight of her words, her pain laid bare for all to see. Trump stepped down from the podium, taking a single step toward her. His eyes softened with a gentleness that felt deeply personal. "It's never too late," he said, his voice quiet yet resolute. "Faith isn't something you lose forever. It's something that waits for you, even if you've turned away. Sometimes, in the quietest moments, when you least expect it, faith finds its way back to you." The woman nodded slowly, tears streaming down her cheeks. Others in the audience wiped their own eyes, moved not only by Trump's response but by the shared sense of connection with her story. In the silence that followed, Emily's small voice suddenly broke through. It was clear and steady despite her size. "My grandma used to say that faith is like planting seeds. she said. "You can't always see them grow right away, but she told me you have to believe that one day they will bloom." The room seemed to awaken at her words. Trump smiled, a warm and genuine expression crossing his face. "Your grandmother was a very wise woman," he said, his voice filled with admiration. "And she was absolutely right. Faith is a seed. It doesn't always sprout immediately, but that doesn't mean it's not growing. Sometimes the strongest seeds are the ones we can't see." Trump's words, coupled with the image of Emily holding her Bible close to her chest, created a sense of profound peace throughout the hall. People began to exchange glances filled with quiet understanding. A few started to smile gently, feeling the warmth that seemed to radiate across the room like a shared embrace. In that moment, it was as if the walls of the hall dissolved, leaving everyone connected not by their differences, but by the common threads of hope, doubt, and the shared belief that faith, like a seed, could grow, even in the most unexpected places. Trump straightened up, his gaze sweeping across the hall once more. But this time, he wasn't looking at a distant crowd. Instead, he looked into each face, into the eyes that now glimmered with shared empathy. The atmosphere was filled with warmth and an indescribable sense of connection. "We live in a world full of division," he began, his voice firm yet carrying a rare gentleness. "A world where, too often, we forget what truly matters. We chase after external things, success, wealth, power, and believe they'll fill the emptiness inside us. But the truth is, nothing can replace faith." He turned toward Emily, his eyes shining with admiration and affection. "Emily," he said softly, "you've reminded all of us that faith isn't just something we talk about. Faith is something we live. It's not found in grand sermons, but in small, brave actions, like the question you asked tonight." Emily smiled, her face radiating pride, yet her demeanor remained humble. Trump's words were more than just a compliment. They were a testament to the power of small actions and simple questions that can change everything in a single moment. Turning back to the audience, Trump once again scanned the room. "If there's one thing I want all of us to take away from tonight," he said, his voice slow and deliberate, "it's this. Faith isn't about having all the answers. Faith is about trusting, even when you can't see the path ahead. And sometimes, the simplest questions are the most important ones." He paused, allowing his words to settle into the hearts of everyone in the room. Then, with a gentle smile, he added, "Ask yourself, what does faith mean to me? Don't be afraid of the answer, because faith isn't about perfection. Faith is about trying every day, to be better, to love more, and to hope more deeply." Trump's closing words spread through the hall like a light, illuminating the faces of those present. The applause began softly, tentatively, but quickly grew into a wave of heartfelt clapping that filled the room. Yet it wasn't just applause. Some bowed their heads, silent tears streaming down their faces, finding comfort they hadn't expected. Others exchanged knowing glances, quiet smiles filled with meaning. Emily, still standing with her worn Bible clutched in her hands, looked at Trump with eyes full of gratitude. She didn't need to say anything more. She knew that her question had sparked something profound, not just for Trump, but for everyone in the room. As the applause gradually subsided, Trump stepped down from the podium and began walking slowly toward Emily. The room fell silent once more, but this time, it was a silence filled with connection and hope. Each of Trump's steps, though measured, carried the weight of the shared emotion that had just unfolded. He stopped in front of Emily, bending down to meet her bright, determined eyes. "Thank you, Emily," he said, his voice deep and sincere. "You have a courage that many adults don't. Never lose that." Emily smiled again, the glow of pride and humility mingling on her face. In that moment, her small, brave act had become a symbol of something far greater: faith, hope, and the quiet strength to ask the questions that truly matter. Emily smiled, her cheeks flushing a soft pink. Her voice was small but clear as she said, "Thank you, Mr. Trump. I think my grandma would be proud." Trump smiled warmly, his eyes soft with tenderness. "Not just proud, Emily," he said. "She would be amazed by you." At that moment, the entire hall seemed to hold its breath as Trump gently placed his hand on Emily's shoulder. A simple gesture, yet it carried the weight of compassion and encouragement. Trump returned to the podium, his gaze sweeping across the hall once more. This time, it wasn't just a crowd he looked upon. It was a room filled with individuals whose hearts were now intertwined by a shared experience. "If something tonight touched your heart," he began, his voice steady but gentle, "hold on to it. Let it grow, like the seeds of faith Emily reminded us about. And if you know someone who needs to hear this story, share it with them. Because sometimes a single question, a small act, can change an entire day, or even a life." He paused, allowing his words to settle deeply into the audience, then added with a faint smile, "Faith isn't just something we talk about. Faith is how we live. And when we live with faith, we don't just change our own lives, we can change the world." His expression softened further as he concluded, "If you felt something special tonight, let it spread. Tell your loved ones, your friends, about what faith can do. And if you'd like to hear more stories that touch the heart like this one, subscribe to our channel. Each story is a small gift, a reminder that even in the hardest times, hope is always there." The hall erupted into applause, louder and more heartfelt than ever before. This time, the applause wasn't just for Trump or Emily. It was for everyone in the room, for the connections they had shared and the hope they had rediscovered together. As people stood, exchanging nods, gentle smiles, and even tearful embraces, they knew they were leaving the hall different from how they had entered. Emily turned to her mother, her eyes still bright with pride. "I think Grandma would be so happy, Mom," she said softly. Her mother smiled, tears shimmering in her eyes as she whispered, "Not just happy, Emily. She would be prouder of you than anything else." Thank you for taking the time to watch this inspiring story. If it touched your heart, please share it with someone you love. And don't forget to hit subscribe so you won't miss more meaningful stories like this one. Together, let's spread faith, hope, and love. Thank you, and we'll see you in the next video.